Today, we are concluding our series, You're Not the Boss of Me. You're Not the Boss of Me. We are in part 5 of this series, and the subtitle kind of says it all. It's a how-to series, how to say no to the emotions that compete for our control. And we have emotions that compete for our control all the time. Excuse me. All of us have emotions that compete for control of our lives, that compete for control of our mood, that compete for control of our mouths, our mood and our mouths, right? These things kind of compete for this, and if we're not careful, they can undermine the most important relationships, most things most valuable to us, the things most important to us. And so far in this series, we've talked about guilt, we've talked about envy, and we've talked about anger. And you can catch all of that online via the One Church app or on our website. You can catch up if you've missed any of these episodes, installments, however you want to really put it out there. But today I want to talk about something that Jesus actually talked about a lot. He talked about a lot. I want us to talk about how we keep fear from becoming the boss of us. How we keep fear from being the boss of us. Fear is a real thing, right? I mean, how many went trick-or-treating this week? I went trick-or-treating with my son Jordan and my wife Jen and my mother-in-law Judy. We were on this street that basically nobody was at. We felt like we were the only ones. And it was funny because one house was like, he must be the firstborn because he's got both parents and his grandma here walking on trick-or-treating. Like, you're not wrong. You are not wrong. Halloween kind of brings out the scary. Right? In fact, our house, Jordan's kind of into spooky stuff right now, and it evokes fear. And if you go to haunted houses, right, the whole goal is to scare you, is to kind of provoke you to kind of scream and out of fright. None of us want fear or worry or anxiety to be the boss of us. And for many of us, fear has never been the boss of us. In fact, for some of you, the people who are closest to you are like, a little fear would do you good. You should have a little bit more fear. You could use a little bit more. You're just so optimistic. You just need a little bit more worry in your life. But for most people, there is an element of fear. There is an element of worry. There is an element that plagues us from time to time. And it's a relationship. It can be in a relationship. It can be in certain environments. It can be in a particular area of our life, and it easily becomes the boss of us. Fear robs us of opportunities, right? Fear robs us of opportunities. Fear interferes with our relationships. Fear impacts how we parent. It impacts how our marriage. It keeps us up at night sometimes. Fear does all of that. But the interesting thing about fear, before we kind of jump into how do we keep it from being the boss of us, this is so important. Fear is obviously not always a bad thing, right? You already knew that. You already knew that fear was not always a bad thing, but here's the cool thing about fear. Fear is actually a byproduct. And fear is actually a byproduct of something that's so important that none of us want to give up what it creates. And what creates fear? Fear is the byproduct of our ability as human beings to accumulate knowledge and to project that knowledge into the future. Fear is the byproduct of our ability to, or inability as human beings, to accumulate knowledge and to project that knowledge into the future. That's what allows us to fear. It's what allows us to fear. In fact, I'll prove it to you. This thing right here. Anybody know what this is? Keeps your door closed, right? We have 2 of these at our house. The reason we got this at our house was because my mother-in-law had this at her house, and my wife was like, you know what, that's a smart idea. So not only do we have a lock and a deadbolt, but we have one of these things in case whoever really wants to get in our house really wants to get in our house. And if that wasn't enough, we have a dog. But honestly, if you just give him treats, he's not a problem. This is like a symbol of fear and worry. And I pass by it every night. I walk in, or we're in our house already, and we're kind of shutting out for the night. And I'm like, I have to shove this under the door. And I'm like, this is kind of crazy, right? I grew up in a neighborhood that I really, we locked our doors, I guess, but whatever. And I don't really feel like we live in a bad neighborhood or a neighborhood that really would kind of, but it's a fear mechanism, right? It's a byproduct of what we know could happen. Because we have knowledge that there are people in our world, there are people in our culture that do break into houses, we get these things. And Master Lock sells these things, right? And it's like, hey, we're going to make a profit on people's fear. It's a byproduct of our ability to accumulate knowledge and then project that into the future. But it's one of the greatest gifts that God has given humanity, and this is what, in fact, it sets it apart in some ways. It's what makes us human. It's what makes us, we're able to collect information and pass it along to generation after generation after generation. So this information and this knowledge base builds and builds and builds. And so we're able to make progress, and we're able to invent things. And where we are today, because the human race has been able to accumulate knowledge and build on that knowledge, build on those things, we project that into the future. And then this is the ability that sort of underscores or allows us to fear, is also the ability that allows us to imagine. It gives us the ability to hope. We accumulate knowledge, we project it into the future. It allows us to dream. It allows us to imagine. Without it, you wouldn't look forward to anything saying, I can't wait. We say that. We say things, well, I can't wait, because you're anticipating something good based on what you know right now. Like, I can't wait until Star Wars comes out in December, because I kind of know that it's going to be good based on the information that I have in my head right now and the trailers that I've seen. I can't wait for that thing to happen. I want to see that so bad. I can't wait. We couldn't have that unless we had the ability to accumulate knowledge and to build upon that and project it into the future. And so I don't think any of us would be willing to give that up if that's what it took to get rid of all fear. We don't like fear. But if we give up the ability to accumulate knowledge and project it into the future, we're giving up some things that really contribute to our fear. Our ability to imagine has more upside, way more upside than downside. Because this is the thing that God has given us that has allowed us to invent things, right? It's allowed us to make the world a better place. It's allowed us to improve our lives and to improve our world. But it also creates a potential for fear, because it creates an endless series of what ifs, right? This whole door thing is, what if someone tries to break into our house? What if this happens? What if, and there's a continuously endless rotation of what ifs that circulate in our head, and that's really what's causing us to fear, because what ifs is what about the future based on what I know about the present. Now, as you know probably pretty well, sometimes fear is a good thing. Sometimes fear is a parenting strategy, right? Sometimes fear is a parenting strategy. You know that. Sometimes fear is a good thing. I'm not recommending it for every parent, but a little fear from time to time is all right. I don't think it works right now. I think I'm doing something wrong, because we'll threaten, like, hey, Jordan, do you want a spanking? And it doesn't faze him at all. Like, I got to figure out some other tactic. Fear is not working, or our follow through, one of the two. He knows. He's like, whatever, Dad. You're not going to do it. You're not going to do it. But fear is good, but you don't want it, and I don't want fear to be the boss of me, and you don't want fear to be the boss of you. There's a place for fear, but we don't want it to run our lives and ruin our lives. And so it always puts us off balance. In fact, whenever we allow any of these emotions to take control of our lives, we are immediately off balance. We're distracted. We're overly protected, and fear causes us to be very, very, very self-absorbed. What if this is going to happen? What if this happens to me? I need to make sure that I'm set up this way, because there's potential over here for there to be harm or danger or something that's going to present pain or hurt, or just something that's going to affect me in a negative way. Now, what's so fascinating to me, and I hope this is fascinating to you, is that Jesus said a lot about fear, but what Jesus says about fear can seem really, really naive if you listen to what Jesus says about fear and isolation. right? And one of the problems is with how the Bible is kind of laid out and has been presented to many of us is that we take these stories, we take these incidents, and we kind of take them in bite-sized, isolated incidents and say, hey, here's the lesson. And we're like, that doesn't make sense all the time. And we drop into this like this, and it's nobody's fault, but this is the way the world. We drop into an isolated incident from the life of Jesus, and then we kind of sort of it look like, hey, once upon a time this happened, the end. But in fact, Jesus was entire ministry, especially with his 12 apostles. Part of the journey was to teach them how not to be afraid, because the bottom line for Jesus teaching when it came to fear, Jesus was like, the bottom line is, I don't want you to be afraid. So he would just say, stop it. He would say things, just don't be afraid. Just fear not. And of course, the disciples would be like, thanks, Jesus, that's not helpful. Right? Like why hadn't I thought? I should just stop being afraid. There we go. I'm good now. I'm good. In other words, to use our terminology, he would say, don't let fear or stop allowing fear to be the boss of you. And he would just say, stop being afraid, which of course is very easy to say, but virtually impossible to do. And at first, this is so interesting, his first century followers, especially the 12 disciples, they felt the same way because Jesus would say, fear not, don't be afraid. And during their time with Jesus, they believed him. But what does that mean? And how do you do that? And doesn't that seem a little naive? And so we're going to walk a little bit through a couple of these incidents. So on one occasion, Jesus had just identified his 12 disciples, and that's pretty cool, right? There's probably a lot of different people, and you're like, I hope I get picked, and Jesus picks you, It probably didn't happen like a dodgeball game at school, but, he identified his 12 disciples, and again, if you've been with us, everywhere Jesus went, there was a crowd. There was a crowd everywhere he went, and then there was a smaller group of people that he hung out with all the time. They're called disciples, right? John calls this group the disciples, and this smaller crowd that went everywhere with Jesus, everywhere Jesus went. So the disciples are there, and then there are the apostles that they were a little bit larger group of people, the men that Jesus chose specifically to kind of be in his core, his inner circle, right? So Jesus just finished choosing these guys. How amazing is that? You got to be in Jesus' inner circle, right? You got to be in Jesus' inner circle of influencers, of followers, of what have you. And so he gets them together and he says, okay, let me tell you what's going to happen. I'm going to tell you the big picture. Here's the whole narrative. Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to send you out like sheep among wolves. Now to us, that's just a figure of speech. But to them, they've literally seen that, right? It doesn't end up pretty. It doesn't. And so he's like, I'm going to send you out about sheep among wolves. That is a bloody, gory mess. All that's left are hooves and a little bit of mess, and everything else is devoured, right? That's kind of what they're imagining, picturing in their mind. Here's the good news. Now that you signed on, Jesus says, let me tell you what the contract reads. I'm going to send you out like sheep among wolves, and you're going to be arrested, and you're going to be beaten. And then he says, do not be afraid. And they're looking at each other, right? Oh, did we miss something? Did you hear everything? Like, that doesn't quite add up to me. I don't really feel encouraged in this. What did we really sign out? Like, it's like you're going to send us out, and and eventually they were sent out, and eventually they were arrested, and eventually they were all beaten, and many of them were executed. But just saying at the end that therefore don't be afraid is not only did it not take away any of the fear, like I said, if I told you, just, hey, I know this is going to happen, just don't be afraid. Don't worry about it. It doesn't make any sense. So Jesus, and this is the part that we miss. Jesus took them on a field trip. And now you're very familiar with field trips, I assume. I had some growing up. I'm pretty certain you probably did too. But when you read about the field trip, you don't think of it as a field trip. You kind of see it as an isolated incident or event in Jesus' life. But his disciples, everything Jesus did was so purposeful, so impactful. It was all going somewhere. It was all connected. And this was like a field trip Jesus set up to teach them a lesson about fear. We're going to talk about a couple different field trips. Field trip number 1. we find in the book of Matthew, chapter 8. Field trip number 1. He goes, this is what it says. Then he got into the boat, and his disciples followed him. Suddenly, a furious storm came up on the lake, so that the waves swept over the boat. This is what they get for following Jesus. They get to be on a boat in the middle of a storm, a furious storm, being tossed. And this isn't like a yacht or somewhere that, probably had indoor quarters, right? Or whatever. And they have, no, not right? This is bad. Everything is loud. People are shouting left and right. It's a smaller boat. People are, and it says this, but Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went and woke him. Lord, save us. We're going to drown. He replied, you of little faith, why are you so afraid? And to which they would probably say, we're so afraid because there's a furious storm and waves are sweeping over the boat. And we may drown. And when you may drown, you are afraid. So then he got up, the text says. He got up and he rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. And the men were amazed and asked, what kind of man is this? Who is this man, they asked. Even the winds and waves obey him. Even the winds and waves obey him. Now, this isn't like, rock star Jesus. Jesus wakes up, his kind of hair flowing, right? Spotlight shining down on Jesus. Winds and waves. Like, this is like, you got to think, you're on a boat. It's the wind, the storm is like hair matted down kind of thing, right? No one looks pretty. He just kind of gets up calmly, like, and rebukes the wind and the waves. They go down, and they're just admiring at the kind of person. Who is this man? Who is this guy? Even the winds and the waves obey him. And when Peter told Mark about this story, Mark wrote it down in his gospel. Mark's version says this. It says, literal Greek translation said, they feared a great fear. They feared a great fear. There was something that they were fearing they were fearing a greater fear than what was actually happening. Their latter fear was far greater than their former fear. Their fear of whose presence they were in was greater than their fear of the storm. When they are like, who is this guy? That even the winds and the waves obey him. Their fear of whose presence they were in was greater than the fear of the storm. And for a fleeting moment, their confidence in Jesus overwhelmed their fear. And then, while it was still fresh in their minds, Jesus kind of goes into like a botany illustration. He's like, you know what? I'm going to give you an illustration with nature. And he goes on and says this. He says, don't be afraid of those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather, be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Jesus was saying, hey, don't you remember the boat ride? You were afraid of the wrong thing. You were afraid of the wrong thing. And Jesus keeps going. He says, are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? And to which we would say, I have no idea how much 2 sparrows are worth. But they would know, right? Yet none of them will fall to the ground outside of your Father's care. And even the very hairs of your head are all numbered. So, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. You are more valuable to God than a whole flock of sparrows. This is like 10 cents. No. You're so much more valuable to God than the whole flock of. God knows what's going on in our personal lives, and what Jesus is saying is God cares what's going on in our personal life. Even when bad things happen, we can trust him. And so they're finally getting it. He takes them on this field trip. It's all purposeful. It's all connected. Saying, hey, this is what's going to happen. He probably knew the storm was going to come. He probably sensed that. And the storm comes. He rebukes it. They are now fearful of him more than they're fearful of the storm, which they were afraid for their lives in the storm. And now Jesus kind of says, hey, you are more valuable to God than even what's going on in nature. And God cares about what's going on in nature. But you are more valuable than that. They're finally getting it. So he signed them up for another field trip. And he involves them with kind of feeding 5,000 people with, and after that, their confidence was at an all-time high, right? If you are feeding 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish, and you're able to feed 5,000 people, 5,000 men, really with more like 11,000 people, and you're able to have basketfuls left over, and you're kind of seeing that miracle take place, you can imagine that their confidence was at an all-time high. And immediately after that confidence, we see this. It says this in Matthew chapter 14. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat. In fact, immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and cross to the other side of the lake. And then he sent the other people home. In fact, the Greek word for made or insisted here means that he forced them into the boat. He coerced them into the boat. Why did he have to force them? Because they were probably thinking, we're not getting any more boats with you, dude. Last time we were in a boat with you, it did not end well. He made them again. He pushes them off the beach, and he kind of waves, like, see ya. Like, he's not in the boat with them. He kind of makes them go on without him. In fact, it says he, after sending them home, he went up to the hills, Jesus did, to pray. Night fell, and he was there all alone. Jesus was there all alone. Meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble far away from the land, for a strong wind had risen, and they were fighting heavy waves. He made them get in. He pushes them off waves. Hours later, they're at a standstill. They're rowing against the wind. That's not good. They're like basically in a rowing machine on a lake. They're just kind of rowing against the wind, not going anywhere. They're just kind of rowing. And it says, shortly before dawn, or about 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came to them walking on the water, walking on the lake. Now, Christians don't believe Jesus walked on the water because the Bible tells us so. It's better than that. Matthew, Mark, John all report this. All 3 were eyewitnesses. They also report their embarrassing response. Literary critics actually use this. It's referred to as the criteria of embarrassment. The criteria of embarrassment. This is a literary tactic, a literary term, right? It's used to determine the authenticity of a historical account. If something is embarrassing to a person of importance, the assumption is an author would not have invented the incident. In other words, if something was so embarrassing to the person, the author would not have invented it. So a lot of times people would authenticate the historical account based on the criteria of embarrassment. And so it says this. It goes on. When the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified, even though Jesus said, "Don't be afraid." And in their fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost!" Probably more afraid than that. And they cried out in fear, but Jesus immediately said to them, "Don't be afraid. Take courage. I'm here. I'm here. As long as I am here," he says, "there's no need to follow your fear, even when there's something to be afraid of." As long as I'm here, there's no need to follow your fear, even when there's something to be afraid of. Again, it didn't stick. They feared right up to the end. At the end, Jesus announces to them at the Last Supper, he announces to them this new covenant. He says, this is the new covenant. This is the new way of accessing God and having a right relationship with him. In fact, I'm going to be the sacrifice for this. And he announces this new covenant, and he announces this new movement. You're going to be the church. I'm going to build my church, and the gates of hell is not going to come against it. And he gave this new command. Hey, go make disciples of all nations and baptize them. And I'm going to be with you wherever you go. I'm going to be with you. Love one another. Love your neighbor. Love God. He gives them this new command. This is exactly what they'd been waiting for. They thought he was about to proclaim himself king. He was going to proclaim himself Messiah. And then later that night, Jesus was arrested, and the disciples all panicked. They hid. They lied. They denied him. They watched Jesus be crucified. Afterward, they felt all was canceled out. The new covenant, the new movement, the new command, all of it had been canceled completely out, along with everything that Jesus had taught and had claimed about himself. And however, then they peered into an empty tomb, right? And then later they met their resurrected friend. And then it clicked. They were back in business. Jesus' resurrection punctuated everything he taught and said about himself. Things that made no sense before now made perfect sense. Especially what he said about fear. Because for us, the resurrection is Easter. For first century believers, it was everything. It was their source of strength. It was their source of boldness, of courage. Jesus' resurrection validated the claims that he made about himself. It proved he could be trusted. The world was still a scary place, but they no longer needed to be afraid. So they feared not. They feared not. And then they came out of hiding. And this is amazing. We can't imagine this. We can't imagine there's not really a parallel in our lives. They willingly faced down the very men that had Jesus arrested, beaten, and crucified. And they went on to change the world. Because fear not is what changed the world. All of a sudden, what was overwhelming them with fear, the reason they hid and lied and denied and scattered, all of a sudden they faced it because of the resurrection. A generation of men and women, the first generation of Christians, lost their fear of death. And when someone has lost their fear of death, it's very difficult to threaten them. Years later, a second century medical writer named Claudius Galenus writes in a journal. He was a Roman medical person, he had the opportunity to kind of go out into the arena and examine the bodies of dying Christians during the reign of Marcus Aurelius. You'll know Marcus Aurelius from the movie Gladiator, right? So during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, we got to have all of a sudden we have the gladiator kind of things happening, and we see Christians dying in this Colosseum. And these medical examiners, they were able to examine the bodies of dying Christians, but they were not allowed to examine dead bodies. Back in those days, it was illegal for doctors to examine dead bodies. Once a body was dead, you had to bury it immediately. You couldn't do autopsies. It was illegal to open up a dead body and learn anything about how the body worked. It's one of the reasons why it took so long for medicine to advance, especially during a period when you couldn't examine any dead body. So the best is that they could kind of hope. They would just wait on the side and kind of see from a distance. And this is so gross, but they would wait on the sidelines of the arena. And once the animals were taken out of the arena, and once the gladiator, the games were over, these doctors could go out and examine the bodies that were dying, but not dead yet. It was their only opportunity to see what was going on. Because after the person had died, they couldn't touch the body anymore. And so this particular medical writer, right, Claudius Galenus, had that opportunity. And this is what he said about Christians in his journal. He said, for fearlessness, this is his observation, right? For fearlessness of death and the hereafter is something we witness in them every day. For fearlessness of death, they don't fear death anymore. And they don't even fear what comes after death anymore. Because they were fearless. We're seeing this happen every single day. It's something that we witness every day. And what changed this was the resurrection of Jesus, because when you worship a risen Lord, when you worship someone who has mastered life and conquered death, when he says to you, fear not, you realize I can fear not because there's nothing to be afraid of, because I have fastened my affection and my attention to the one who deserves so much trust and all my reverence and all of my fear. That's why. Now, fear is a permanent part of our existence, right? Our experience. It's always going to be a part of our existence, part of our experience. It just is. There are lots of ways to cope, but none of us want fear to be the boss of us. And Peter, this is so good. Peter, who failed both boat field trips, who denied even knowing Jesus, after the Passover meal. He basically did everything, who panicked during Jesus' arrest. The same Peter who lied, when questioned, who hid. And then years after the resurrection, he would dictate a letter to Christians, first century Christians, those like us who have believed but have not seen Jesus. And here's what he says to you, here's what he says to me, based on his experience with Jesus. He said, let me tell you what to do. Let me tell you what you have been invited to. And he says this, give all of your worries and your cares to God, for he cares for you. Cast all your anxiety on him, because he cares for you. Cast it, throw it, hurl it, heave it, all of your cares, all of your fears, all of your worries, all of your anxieties on him. Why is that going to help us, Peter? It's because let me tell you what I know that he wants you to know, because he cares for you. Cast all of your cares on him, because I can speak with authority. Peter said, because he cares for you. Literally transfer all of your worry, all of your fretting, all of your anxiety, all of your fears to him, because he cares for you. And Peter should know, because Peter faced things that we can't even imagine. He eventually died in Emperor Nero's realm, because he was confident that the promise Jesus made him, that he was confident that the promise Jesus made the disciples and the apostles, a promise that he's made to you as well. That he would say with the psalmist, though you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you can fear no evil. Fear, you are not the boss of me. I already have a boss who's conquered life and death. He is who he claimed to be. He is worthy of my fellowship, and he is worthy of my worship. And in this way, the life of Jesus is an invitation. It's a promise. It's an invitation to follow him, and it's a promise that you could follow without fear. He says, follow me. Let me tell you, you're going to go through some stuff, but fear not. Don't be afraid. Fear not, even when there's something to be afraid of, because I am with you and because I care for you. Fear is debilitating when we let it be the boss of us. It's crippling. And it's because we have a swirling, constant, endless line of what ifs going around in our head. What if this happens? What if this happens? I don't know what this is going to be. I have a fear of rejection. Or a fear of rejection because I know who I am, and I know my shortcomings, and I think other people may be clued into it as well. So it's my ability to accumulate that knowledge and project it into the future. I don't think I'm that great, so then why would they think that I'm really that great? They're probably going to reject me. I have a fear of failure. I have fear of hurt or pain or fear in relationships, or I have a fear of this happening. What's God saying? Just follow me. And don't be afraid, even when there's something to be afraid of, because I am with you and I care for you. So it doesn't seem as naive when we read it the first time, because I think it's so true and so pointed. And if we take it in the context of everything that Jesus tried to take his followers on, he says, don't be afraid. Fear not. Fear not. Why is it bothering you? As long as I'm here, you don't have to fear. cool thing is that the last thing that Jesus said to his disciples before he ascended was, surely I am with you always, even to the end of the age. The cool thing is that he's always here. So don't be afraid. Let me pray for you today.